Here to talk to us about the historical significance of Chinatowns and why they're struggling so much today is Ken Guest. He's a sociology and anthropology professor at the City University of New York. He's also the author of the book, God in Chinatown, Religion and Survival in New York's Evolving Immigrant Community. That was published back in 2003. Thanks so much for joining us, Ken. You're in New York, a city with a rich Chinese history, and Chinatown. Is there a common thread on how this Chinatown concept actually began?
Well, absolutely. Chinatowns emerged as new immigrants were seeking places of safety in times of intense exclusion, racism, and sometimes violence. So they became safe havens, but also places where new immigrants could gather together to organize ethnic resources, social capital, financial capital, to begin to build some niche economic activities from hand laundries to restaurants.
Kind of famous for both, actually, early on. And as we're talking here, we'll roll some historical footage of Chinatowns here in the United States and tell us what was life like in those early days, especially around the time of the World Wars.
Well, because of the exclusion acts that had been passed that restricted the numbers and types of immigrants that were allowed to come from Chinatown, many of the early, from China to the United States, many of the early Chinatowns were what we called bachelor societies. 90% of the residents were men. And so these areas became places where people could gather to find community, to connect, to find safety, and also organize economic activities.
One thing that's interesting is that young Chinese Americans are really beginning to thrive here in the United States, especially when it comes to getting a college education. I know you've conducted field work in both China and the United States. What are you finding?
Well, I think that's an important piece for us to think about is the complexity of the Chinese American community. And we certainly have immigrants who are coming here as professionals, as students, and who fit the traditional model minority myth that's so often associated with the Chinese, that they come here, they do fantastically well in school, they succeed and go on to Harvard and become doctors and lawyers and engineers. But that's really only a part of the picture that we see with the Chinese immigrant community. My research is focused primarily on labor immigrants, people who come from more rural areas in China, people who come to the U.S. to work in restaurants, garment shops, construction trades. So in the case of Manhattan's Chinatown, this is actually a wave of immigrants which has kept this Chinatown alive and growing, when most of the other Chinatowns in the United States have seen an intense period of decline.
So there in New York, things going well, but as you mentioned, struggling Chinatowns elsewhere. Is that because they've become less relevant for people of Chinese descent, do you think?
Well, I think one of the big factors is that most of the Chinatowns are center city real estate locations. And so as our cities have renewed and grown and become centers for global capital and finance, these areas have become hotly contested in terms of who should be there and what kind of activity the city wants to have there. So real estate prices have been driven through the roof in many of these areas. Industries like garment industries have been forced out because of escalating rents, and also long-term residents are finding it harder and harder to stay there, and certainly new immigrants are having a hard time finding residences and apartments that they can afford. So there's a big change that's going on in the inner city as people relocate there and as cities do more and more urban planning to accentuate the role of the inner city in their global economic activities.
Well, Ken, I mentioned you wrote a book, God in Chinatown, so if you were to write the last chapter on all of this, or the next chapter on all of this, as these communities struggle, as you're describing, where do you see things going?
Well, I think New York City's Chinatown is an interesting case study. It's really a contested terrain. There's certainly a lot of pressure and interest from the city to have that area, which is really only a 15-minute walk from Wall Street, become more integrated into the global economic activities. But at the same time, the new immigrants who are coming have really created an economic incubator there. They are creating the infrastructure, both for the migration of more people from China, but also the infrastructure for an expanding network of Chinese restaurants that has grown across the country. In Chinatown now, you have tens of thousands of jobs being created in that ethnic restaurant economy. Workers, restaurant supplies, menus, and my studies have shown about 50,000 Chinese restaurant workers circulating in and out of New York using employment agencies and Chinatown buses to get to restaurants as far away as Wisconsin, Arkansas, Florida, and Maine. All of that is organized in and around Manhattan's Chinatown. So it's a place where there are conflicting and contested ideas about what the neighborhood should be like, but I think it offers a model for the maintenance of Chinatowns as an immigrant gateway and a place where new immigrants can find work and a place to live as well.
Fascinating story. Ken, thanks so much for joining us from New York. Appreciate it.